Hey, I'm Sam. Welcome to Brickwall Pictures. If you missed it, I just put out a video going through all of the best films that I watched in 2023. And I wanted to take this year-end opportunity to do the same thing for the best video games I played this year. I don't talk about games much on this channel, but it is a medium that I love to both experience and analyze. I've historically been pretty bad about finishing games. What would always happen is I would start a game, really enjoy it, then not find the time to play it for a couple of months, and by the time I'd go back to it, I'd have already forgotten all the controls and where I was in the story and all that. So I started over, and then the same thing just happens again, rinse and repeat. There are a lot of games I love that I've only played like the first 2 or 3 hours of, but multiple times. But as I've become a little bit more serious about the prospect of maybe making my own games at some point in the future, I've made more of a concerted effort to actually finish games, as well as going out of my way to try a wider variety of games than I had in the past, and going back to some classics that I missed or that were just before my time. Part of that has meant me figuring out how to run PC games on my Mac through parallels and whatnot, which is a whole troubleshooting headache. But I finally got all that sorted out just about a week ago at the time that I'm recording this. I just started Half-Life 2 finally, which is a classic that was on my backlog forever. And you can shortly expect that to be on next year's list because I'm only counting games that I have rolled credits on by the end of this year. That roll credits requirement means that a couple of my favorite games from this year that I've been playing and loving aren't eligible yet, but they'll show up next year if I manage to finish them by then either. Quick shout out to Baldur's Gate 3 and Persona 5 Royal, both of which I have sunk dozens of hours into and am loving, but I'm still not even close to finishing. Anyway, on to the list. And you know what? Unlike my Films of 2023 video where I limited myself to only the best that I could highly recommend, I've played far fewer games than I've watched films. So I'll just go ahead and talk about every single one of them. This is every game that I played to completion in 2023, ranked from worst to best. Keep in mind that if I didn't enjoy a game at all, then I'm not very likely to finish it. Shout out Atomic Heart and Starfield and junk like that I jumped ship on a couple hours in. Starting out at the bottom of the list with number 21, which is the Resident Evil 3 remake. After loving the Resident Evil 2 remake, this was such a disappointment. I don't usually mind short games, but this one does feel too short, especially if you paid full price for it. I'm a slow player, like I said earlier, and I had no experience with the original game. I still beat it in under 3.5 hours. I'm glad I waited for a sale on this one and picked it up for $10 instead of full price. But here's the thing, even with such a short length, the game still outstayed its welcome. From the very beginning, it starts out with the sort of bombastic action junk that most of the Resident Evil games devolve into in their closing moments, but it's just that schlock stretched out the entire time in this one. The only part of Resi 3 that worked for me and even felt like I was playing a horror game was that one brief section with the giant spider enemies and the infested power plant. That was good stuff, nice and intense. But it was literally the only moment that worked for me in the entire game. I was especially disappointed by Nemesis. I expected him to be a bigger, more robust version of Mr. X from Resi 2, who was awesome. But Nemesis just sucks. His appearances are pretty much just either scripted chase sequences that aren't tense or interesting, or he shows up in these big boss fights, multiple of them, that are extremely easy but beyond tedious. He's so easy to avoid, but he's also a total bullet sponge that just takes forever to kill. It's not scary or fun or interesting. I say skip this one even if you're a fan of the series. You gotta be like a die-hard Resi completionist for this one to be worthwhile. Number 20, Golf Club Wasteland, which was apparently retitled post-release to Golf Club Nostalgia. That's what it's called now, which is just so weird to me. First, it's weird to retitle and rebrand your game after it's released at all for any reason, but especially to give it, what is in this case, clearly a much worse title. Golf Club Nostalgia? That's a bad title. Golf Club Wasteland is a pretty good title. Still a bad game, though. But even though I thought this game kind of sucked, it was also extremely short, so I did finish it. You can beat the whole thing in under an hour, easily. Honestly, more like half an hour. I thought it looked really cool. A game set in a post-apocalypse where you have to hit a golf ball through all the debris and abandoned buildings and whatnot. There's a lot of potential to that concept, but it all goes completely unfulfilled. The level design is weak and it does not make the most of the concept. The art looks nice-ish, I guess, but there's a clarity issue where it's often impossible to tell which surfaces and walls are platforms and which are just part of the background. And it isn't even consistent about it. There might be a dozen windowsills on screen and the golf ball will bounce off 7 of them and go straight through the rest of them. It also just feels bad to control, which, like, come on, it's golf. There are so many golf games that got it right. It should be easy. The game only uses like 1 button and the directional stick. There's so much more that they could have done with it. Number 19 is Supraland, 6 Inches Under. This is the first game on the list that I enjoyed. We are out of the negative territory, and everything else are games that I enjoyed to varying degrees. This is a platform puzzler that stumped me and left me lost a couple of times, but it usually felt fair, and some of the puzzles and ways to progress are quite ingenious. I think I might have just been a little too dumb for this game. How Long to Beat, that website that measures how long it takes to beat games, as the name implies, says that this game is supposed to take an average of 8 to 11 hours to finish, but it took my dumb ass more like 20 hours. Even still, though, I enjoyed my time with it, while also listening to podcasts. That's right, this is an ideal play on mute while listening to podcasts game, or on low volume anyway. It's nothing too spectacular, but it's fun. Also, apparently it's a sequel, which I didn't know when I started it. I would check out the other games in the series. Number 18, Alan Wake. The sequel just came out recently, and I am looking forward to playing it, but I actually just played the first one way back at the start of this year. Just because I had always wanted to, not because the sequel is coming out. More than Halo or Gears of War, Alan Wake, for whatever reason, was the one Xbox exclusive that I always wanted to play the most back when I only had PlayStation consoles. After so many years of wanting to play it for its Twin Peaksiness and cool-looking horror action fusion, I was actually a little disappointed by it. But to be fair, I did have years of hyped-up expectations brewing, so that's only natural, really. It ended up being the writing that really let me down. I think Remedy games have some pretty great writing elsewhere, or at least cool ideas and storytelling stylization, even when the actual writing isn't always quite as sharp as they're going for. But I mostly just found Alan Wake's narrative clunky and honestly a little amateurish. I still enjoyed the game for the most part, obviously, but I'm hoping to enjoy the sequel far more and see that potential fully met. Number 17, Wolfenstein: The Old Blood. This was sort of a half game in between 2 mainline Wolfenstein games, The New Order and The New Colossus, except it's actually a prequel to The New Order, just released between the two. It very much feels like a glorified DLC, but I don't really mind the shorter length, honestly. That's fine with me. At the end of the day, though, the game was just kind of middling. It was fine, not as memorable as the other two. Oh, I also gave Wolfenstein Youngblood a shot this year, and oh man, that one outright sucked. I'm not finishing that one. Number 16, Midnight Fight Express. It's a fun little beat-em-up with a clear and potentially overly done John Wick influence. I mean, there's even a guy called Mr. Wick at one point, as if they needed to make it any more obvious. It's made by a really small team. I've seen it called the solo dev, but there are a few other people involved, so I don't know. I don't know what qualifies as a solo dev, I guess. But at any rate, it's really impressive for coming from such a small team. Where it really comes up short is just in the story and writing, which was no good whatsoever. I found myself skipping past all of the try-hard, unfunny dialogue by the end to get to the fights, which are appropriately chaotic, and they do provide a good ramp-up in complexity and difficulty throughout. Some elements like the skill tree feel a little half-baked or just unnecessary. And there was an individual boss fight in the middle of the game that was several orders of magnitude more difficult than anything else in the game, seemingly by accident, like it wasn't play-tested. I'm talking about the part where you have to outrun a big farm equipment thing that chases you down the street. I had to play that part dozens of times, and I was genuinely starting to think that it was just glitched and impossible to progress. Maybe they fixed that with a patch at some point. I mean, that would be a good idea if they haven't. Number 15, Jusant. I was really looking forward to this game. I've been saying for years that there should be a narrative-driven game that's focused entirely on climbing, but with really in-depth climbing mechanics. Climbing's a big part of many games, from Assassin's Creed to Uncharted, but there's more potential to add a whole lot more complexity and nuance to the climbing mechanics when that's the whole focus. Jusant kind of delivered on what I was hoping for, but it came up just a little short in a couple of areas, namely the world building, the storytelling, and the challenge. The game's easy to the point of practically playing itself. There are a couple areas that require you to think a little more or use a little more effort to do things quickly, But for the most part, it's a little too straightforward, and it could have done more with its admittedly deep climbing mechanics. I would have loved for them to push those mechanics further. And then the world building is just kind of basic and bland, and the story is told entirely through notes that you find, which just aren't that interesting, and also, that's just not a great way to tell a story, picking up notes. Like, it's kind of just the easiest, quickest way to get exposition out. The whole notes and games thing is such a standard, and it can be done well, especially when it's accompanying a story rather than constituting the entirety of it, I think. Still, Jusant was an enjoyable enough time that didn't outstay its welcome. I would play a sequel or just another game that pushes those same mechanics further. Number 14. Xcom 2. This is a game that I've been playing off and on for years, like many, many years, like since it came out pretty much. And I finally got around to finishing the main campaign. And that was just the vanilla version, not even including all the extra stuff that has come out post-launch. I've dabbled in that extra stuff, but I haven't beaten the campaign with it. The type of challenge in XCOM can feel rather unfair and bullshit at times, and it ends up being kind of a frustrating affair sometimes. But I do still really like the game at the end of the day, and just like Supraland, this is one that I mostly played while listening to podcasts. It doesn't demand your full, undivided attention. Number 13, Super Mario Galaxy. I never had Nintendo consoles for the most part, so it wasn't until I bought a Switch a couple years ago that I was finally able to start going through the old Nintendo back catalog for real. At least the parts of that back catalog that Nintendo has seen fit to either remake or allow on the eShop for crazy high price tags. Not a fan of how they run the business side of things, but I am a fan of their games, at least the small number of them that I've played so far. I wasn't quite as crazy about Galaxy as a lot of people were. It's definitely not my favorite Mario game out of the ones I've played, but there's a lot of creativity here and some really fun levels. It's mostly the camera and the motion controls that really hurt this one for me. And those things really get in the way of me having fun. Out of the big Mario games that I've played all the way through, it's behind Odyssey, Super Mario Land, and 3D Land, but ahead of the earlier 2D games and new Super Mario Brothers. Oh, and ahead of that first Mario Rabbids Tactics game, if you want to count that one. Probably not, though. Number 12, Dishonored 2. I really like the game design philosophy of Arcane, but their flagship series is the one that I'm actually kind of the least interested in, not counting Redfall, which I have negative interest in ever even trying. My favorite of theirs by miles is Prey, but that wasn't a game I beat this year, it was previously, so don't expect to see that on the list. Dishonored 2 I can recognize as a phenomenally well-designed game, but I just don't get quite as much out of it as I want to or that most people seem to. I admire so much about it, and I really do enjoy aspects of it and certain level gimmicks, which are always so creative, like the Clockwork Mansion or the time travel level. I enjoy it well enough, but I respect and admire it far, far more. Immersive sims have become something of an obsession or fascination for me in the last couple of years, and Arcane has done well to keep that genre going in an age where it isn't very common any longer. Number 11, Yakuza 0. My entry point to the sprawling Yakuza series, which I see has been rebranded to the Like a Dragon series, but one of the games is called Yakuza: Like a Dragon, so that's a little confusing, but I guess it's like how Resident Evil 7 had the Biohazard subtitle, despite the entire series being called Biohazard in other countries. But let's not get too distracted with that. Yakuza 0 was a great time, and it's the game I finished most recently, just a day before I started writing the video that I am now delivering to camera a week or so later. Barring a couple of late-stage plot developments that didn't 100% jive with me and a general tendency to bloviate and drag things out far longer than necessary, other than that stuff, the storytelling here is fantastic, and there's a real grasp of cinematography that the majority of games lack. Plenty of games have better graphics, like, they look better technically, but there's so much more attention paid here to the framing, lighting, camera movement, and editing of the cutscenes, the stylization, all of that stuff. It's great, and it's appropriately evocative of the myriad clear influences from the world of cinema. I know all of the mini-games and whatnot are a huge draw for this series, but I honestly wasn't really interested in any of them. I mostly stuck to the main plot and the handful of sub-stories that weren't off the beaten path. I tried a bunch of the minigames, and I either found them tedious or confusing, so I ended up just ignoring most of them. As I continue through the other Yakuza games, which I'm already doing presently, I will keep trying the other minigames and side content and see if I like it anymore. The combat is fun and supremely stylish, but it does often devolve into just random button mashing. It can get a little repetitive, even with 3 fighting styles for each of the 2 protagonists. I don't think I ever lost a fight after the first chapter when I was just figuring things out, so maybe a slight lack of challenge might have contributed to that repetitive feeling. Uncertain. One big annoyance for me was the enemy knockdown effects, which were much more frustrating than they needed to be, especially when the game starts giving enemies handguns and having them shoot you from off-screen. The occasional loop you get stuck in where you're knocked down, you gotta mash the button to get up, and then you're immediately knocked down again before you're even given control of the character back over and over again. That was beyond annoying and tedious. Luckily, that's the only truly frustrating hindrance to what is otherwise a solid game and a great entry point to the series that I am excited to continue with. I'm now playing the aforementioned Yakuza Like a Dragon. I jumped to that one. And we're now into the top 10. Number 10 is Halo 3. Since getting an Xbox for the first time, I've been slowly making my way through the Halo series, but slowly is really the operative word there, because after a couple of years, I've still only gotten through Halo 2 and 3. I had already played the original way back in the day, and I didn't replay it, so that's not getting in the way. Despite how slow I've been playing them, I do really enjoy the series. I think I enjoyed 2 slightly more than 3, but not by a huge margin. The vehicle section that capped off the game was such a dumb move, though, when your series is famous for having awful vehicle controls. It's like, don't you have a little self-awareness? I don't know. Number 9, Dead Space 2. I had the PS3 version of this way back, but my copy was used and apparently slightly damaged. So every time I reached a particular doorway, the whole game would freeze and crash and it was impossible for me to progress. That was only about 2 hours into the game, so I couldn't get any further than that. Years later, this year, I played a digital copy on my Xbox and I got through the whole thing. And I had a great time. I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion or not, but I think Dead Space 2 is leaps and bounds better than the first game. Here's something that I know is an unpopular opinion. I think the first Dead Space is overrated. I think it's great for a couple hours, and then it just repeats its same shallow bag of tricks for several more hours, and it gets so unscary and boring long before the end. 2 has so much more variety and more ideas to avoid that same pitfall. Number 8, A Plague Tale Requiem. I really enjoyed A Plague Tale Innocence when I played it last year, and I can say the same about the sequel, A Plague Tale Requiem, to an even greater degree. All of the biggest problems that I had with the first game were pretty much addressed here. One of the biggest of which was the main villain being a ridiculous cartoonish stereotype that didn't fit how grounded everything else was in that first game. The sequel crafts a better villain and a stronger overall storyline. It's a little bloated and bigger than it needs to be, with a couple of characters that could honestly probably be axed all together and have made for a tighter, stronger project. But it's always interesting and absolutely stunning visually, especially fantastic use of color and general art direction. I also appreciated how bold some of the storytelling choices were, rather than just trying to milk the property with endless sequels rehashing the same shtick. They could have surely cash grabbed this into a trilogy, but I'm glad that they reached a proper conclusion, since so many video game series are deprived of that. They could still feasibly keep making games in this world following the player character, but it's at least an appropriate end to this story. Number 7, Portal 2. This is one of those big classics that I finally went back and played. I had actually already played through the 2-player campaign with a friend all the way back in high school, but I never had my own copy and never went through the single player. But I finally played through the whole single player campaign in 2023. And I was actually still trading off with a friend because that's kind of the ideal way to play puzzle games and whatnot anyway, right? Portal 2, of course it's great. It's so funny. The writing is so sharp and witty with great vocal performances to deliver all of that funny dialogue. Stephen Merchant, J.K. Simmons, come on, they're great. Number 6, Mass Effect Legendary Edition. Talk about big classics. I finally made my way through the first Mass Effect. I had tried to play the PS3 version of this game a couple of years ago, and I just couldn't get past how awful I found the gameplay to be. I hated the shooting and the abilities and all that. So anytime a combat section came in, it just felt like such a slog to me. And I never made it very far into the game. But now, years later, I gave it another shot with that Legendary Edition remaster of the trilogy, and I finally found that diamond in the rough that everyone else already loved for so many years. I don't know if it was the quality of life improvements of the Legendary Edition that helped me get past that rough facade, or maybe just a change in my own mindset and preferences and priorities, maybe a combination of all of the above. But I ended up loving this. Fantastic sci-fi world building, interesting lore, and great storytelling. Held back a little bit by how many of your choices are so clearly fake choices. It happens often where you'll choose an option and Shepard just does what one of the other options said instead anyway. And it's like, how about don't pretend to give me the option then? I actually looked into it, and it seems like the team at BioWare ran out of time and money to fully flesh out all of their planned choices, so that's why it's like that. But I also heard that that wasn't an issue with the sequels, so I'm looking forward to those. I also just hated every time I had to pilot the Mako. Just like Halo 3, I feel like there's no shot they lacked the self-awareness to know that that thing handled like ass and was not fun to control. So why make so many long, mandatory vehicle segments? Anyway, that's a black spot on an otherwise really fantastic game overall. I jumped right into the sequel, but then I got distracted with other stuff, so I haven't actually made it too far into it yet, but I hope to get back into it before too long. Number 5, Deathloop. Arcane is back, and I think it's probably an unpopular opinion to rank Deathloop so much higher than Dishonored 2, but I gotta be honest, I had much more fun with this one. I loved exploring these little interconnected hub worlds, building out an arsenal, and slowly piecing together the optimal path to take out all of the visionaries in one run. Actually beating the game was so goddamn satisfying. I love how the game presents objectives as just leads that you have to explore and figure out for yourself. I would love to see other games implement similar things. And I loved how open and free-form the hub areas and your objectives were. Arcane embracing the semi-open world immersive sim ideal to the fullest. The sandbox they created lends itself to many immensely satisfying smaller moments along the way. Now, the game certainly isn't perfect. It can be quite repetitive even for a time loop game that's all about repetition. Having falling in the water be an instant kill was pretty stupid. And the game certainly loses a little steam once you've decided, okay, this is my permanent arsenal. I've optimized my loadout and abilities. Because then exploration becomes less motivated, and you're left with just the main objective to crack on. But those are really my only quibbles with the game. I loved my time with it. Number 4, Citizen Sleeper. I loved this so much. It's amazing how immersed you can get in the game, considering it's mostly just text laid over a static overhead view of a really simplistic sci-fi setting. The characters are all still images that hardly ever change, yet they feel so fully formed and engaging to interact with. The gameplay loop essentially consists of micromanaging dice rolls and a bunch of systems and meters, which again doesn't sound engaging, but it absolutely is. This game thoroughly hooked me in a way that most games don't, and I had to see it through to the end in a short time span. I found it pretty strongly reminiscent of Disco Elysium, which I actually love even more than Citizen Sleeper, but I haven't managed to finish it despite having it and occasionally playing it for over 3 years now. That's what I'm talking about with not finishing games. I gotta get around to finishing that one because it is just unbelievably good. Number 3, A Short Hike. True to the title, this game is extremely short, but it's such a perfectly delightful little time that does actually pack in a surprising amount of gameplay and variety into its tiny package. Shout out to Rasputin on YouTube for consistently recommending this game at every opportunity and convincing me to give it a shot. If you have Game Pass, it's on there now, and I think it's a must-play for everybody. You can finish it in just a sitting or two. Number 2, Inscryption. This game blew my mind more times than Tobias blew himself. I adored everything about this game so much. The less said about this one, the better. Go in knowing as little as possible, like I did, for the best experience. It is so much more than First Meets the Eye. And importantly, what First Meets the Eye is still extremely fun and presents a roguelike card game like Slay the Spire, but with a fun horror aesthetic. Inscryption was my game of the year for many months, but then October rolled around, and I finally got around to playing number 1, the Resident Evil 4 remake. Resident Evil 3 remakes at the bottom of the list, Resident Evil 4 remakes at the top. Over on my second channel, Brickwall Unplugged, I ran a single elimination tournament to crown the best horror video game ever made. At that time, I hadn't yet played the Resident Evil 4 remake. I was just talking about the original, or the PS2 version at least. That version won the entire tournament, It has long been one of my favorite games, definitely my favorite horror game. The thing is, I was skeptical of a remake of Resident Evil 4 justifying its own existence because I still hold the original in such high esteem, especially after how lame the Resi 3 remake turned out. But I was blown away by the quality of the remake. It does so much more than just justify its own existence. It's truly remarkable what they did here. I have so much to say about this game and the original that I could make an entire 2-hour video comparing the two, but I don't think anyone wants to watch that, so I'll keep it brief and just say that there are still reasons to go back to the older version of the game. The remake isn't a complete replacement like some might have you believe, but it is now the definitive way to play one of the best games ever made, and certainly one of my favorite games of all time. So that was everything I played to completion in 2023. I can tell you that I got my numbers way, way, way up from previous years where I usually only finish 4 or 5 games at most, and they were usually all shorter games. I had a couple long-ass games in here this year. And just for full transparency, a couple of these games like Yakuza 0 and Mass Effect are games that it actually took me about 2 full years to finish. I wasn't strictly playing them in 2023 alone. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and go check out my best films of the year video if you didn't watch that one already. See you next time. So long.